My dog watched me sleep, and then it spoke. If you like the story, please subscribe to help me bring more stories like this. Now let's get started. The hum of the computer screen was the only sound in the room, accompanied by the faint rhythmic tapping of Emma's keyboard. The clock on her desk blinked 2:47 a.m., but sleep was the last thing on her mind. Emma was no stranger to late night, rabbit holes on the internet, and the deep web had always held a particular fascination for her. It wasn't the stereotypical horror stories of hackers or illicit dealings that intrigued her. Rather, it was the unexplored corners, the strange forums, cryptic messages, and eerie tales shared by anonymous users. That night, she found herself scrolling through a forum she hadn't visited before. Its plain black background and simple, white text gave it a stark, unsettling feel. One thread caught her eye, its title blinking faintly as if calling out to her, "Your pets know more than you think." A small chill ran down her spine, but curiosity overruled her hesitation. She clicked. Inside, the thread was full of fragmented stories, each more bizarre than the last. The first post described a cat that seemed to predict accidents before they happened, staring intently at its owner just moments before a glass would shatter or a picture frame would fall. Another user claimed their parrot would mimic a voice they didn't recognize, whispering warnings late at night. But the one that struck her the most was a tale of a golden retriever who allegedly whispered its owner's name during a power outage. The owner had described the sound as a low, guttural voice, nothing like the playful barks or whimpers they were used to hearing. Emma leaned back in her chair, scoffing softly. "People will believe anything," she muttered to herself, glancing over at Max, her own golden retriever. He was sprawled across his usual spot at the foot of her bed, snoring softly, blissfully unaware of her late-night obsession. Max had been Emma's companion for 5 years, and she often joked that he was more human than dog. He had a knack for knowing when she was upset, always pressing his head against her leg as if to comfort her. Despite his size, Max was goofy and harmless, more likely to trip over his own paws than intimidate anyone. The idea of him doing something, as eerie as whispering her name, seemed laughable. But as the night wore on, Emma couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her. Something about the stories in the thread lingered, planting seeds of doubt in her otherwise logical mind. She rationalized it as a mix of sleep deprivation and her overactive imagination, yet her eyes kept drifting back to Max. He looked peaceful, but there was something almost too still about the way he lay there. She shook her head and shut the laptop. "I'm letting this get to me," she said aloud, her voice breaking the silence. Max didn't stir. Normally, the sound of her voice, even softly spoken, was enough to make his ears perk up. But tonight, he remained motionless. That first night, Emma didn't think much of it. She brushed it off and crawled into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. Yet as she lay there in the dark, her mind kept replaying the strange stories she'd read. What if there was some truth to them? What if animals really could see or sense things that humans couldn't? The thought was unsettling, but she finally managed to drift off. Around 3:30 a.m., Emma woke with a start. She wasn't sure what had roused her at first, but the room felt different, heavier somehow. Her eyes adjusted to the dim glow of her computer screen, still on but idle, and then she saw him. Max, no longer lying at the foot of the bed. He was sitting upright near the doorway, staring into the dark hallway beyond. His posture was rigid, his ears alert. "Max," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. He didn't turn his head, didn't acknowledge her at all. It was as if he couldn't hear her, or worse, as if he was too focused on something else. A shiver ran down her spine. "Come on, boy, bedtime." She patted the mattress, trying to coax him back, but Max didn't move. His eyes remained locked on the hallway, and for the first time in years, Emma felt a pang of fear. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand and used its flashlight to illuminate the hallway. Empty. Nothing but the faint outlines of furniture greeted her. She got up, her heart pounding, and gently touched Max's head. His fur was warm, reassuringly familiar, but his body felt unnaturally tense. "What's wrong?" she murmured, more to herself than to him. Max finally turned his head to look at her, his eyes catching the light in a way that made them glint eerily. He let out a low whine and licked her hand, but the tension in his body didn't ease. Emma led him back to his bed and sat beside him for a while, stroking his fur until he finally seemed to relax. But as she lay back down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Max had never behaved like that before. He wasn't an anxious dog, and he certainly wasn't one to fixate on shadows or empty spaces. The next day, Emma tried to rationalize the event. Maybe he heard a noise outside, she told herself, though her street was notoriously quiet at night. Or perhaps he had sensed her own anxiety and was mirroring it. Yet, deep down, Emma couldn't dismiss the nagging, feeling that there was more to it. She returned to the forum that evening, scrolling through the thread again. This time she noticed a post she hadn't seen before. It was a warning written in red text. If your pet starts behaving strangely, don't ignore it. They might be trying to protect you. Emma stared at the words, her pulse quickening. Protect her from what? She glanced over at Max, who was once again sitting near the doorway, his ears twitching as if listening to something only he could hear. Over the following nights, Max's behavior grew increasingly unusual. Emma couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong. Normally a carefree and playful dog, Max had become distant and alert, as though constantly on edge. He no longer greeted her at the door with his wagging tail or brought her his favorite chew toy for their nightly game of fetch. Instead, he would sit near the corners of the house, his eyes fixed on spots that seemed utterly mundane to Emma, but appeared to hold immense significance to him. The hallway became Max's favorite spot, much to Emma's discomfort. Every night, after she turned off the lights and prepared to sleep, Max would position himself just outside her bedroom door, sitting upright and motionless, his gaze fixed on the dark expanse beyond. His once lazy demeanor had been replaced by an unnerving intensity. Emma would call out to him, sometimes with a nervous laugh, but Max rarely responded. He would occasionally flick an ear or glance at her briefly, but it was clear his attention was elsewhere. One particular night, Emma tried to break the routine. "Max, come here, boy," she called, patting the bed like she used to. "No more guarding the hallway. Whatever it is out there, I promise it's just shadows." Max didn't move. He let out a low whine, the kind he made when something genuinely upset him, and turned his head back toward the hallway. Emma's stomach twisted. Her logical mind wanted to dismiss his behavior as a fluke, an overreaction to a small noise, or perhaps a sign of age catching up with him. But her gut told her otherwise. It wasn't just Max's behavior that was strange. It was the palpable tension that seemed to fill the house every time the sun went down. During the day, Max appeared almost normal. He would eat his meals, follow Emma around the house, and nap in his usual sunny spots. But as dusk crept in, everything changed. He would become hyper-vigilant, his ears perking up at the slightest creak or distant hum. Emma started to notice the pattern, and it began to weigh on her. "I'm letting the deep web get into my head," Emma muttered one evening, scrolling through the same forum thread that had started her paranoia. The thread had grown longer, with new stories being added almost daily. People shared chilling accounts of their pets, behaving in ways that defied explanation. Cats refusing to enter certain rooms, birds squawking cryptic phrases, and dogs like Max staring at invisible things. One user claimed their dog began scratching at the walls, as if trying to dig through to another dimension. Emma slammed her laptop shut, irritated at herself for indulging in the absurdities. Yet, despite her frustration, she couldn't help but observe Max out of the corner of her eye. He was at the doorway again, his body rigid, his ears twitching. "Max, seriously, what are you looking at?" she asked aloud, her voice tinged with exasperation. She stood up and walked over to him, crouching to meet his gaze. His eyes didn't waver. They were locked on the darkened hallway, as if something were standing there, just out of her sight. A chill ran down Emma's spine. She reached out, placing her hand gently on Max's head. His fur was warm, but his muscles were taut. He didn't flinch at her touch, but let out another low whine, one that seemed almost mournful. It wasn't just the hallway that held Max's attention. Over time, Emma noticed he would fixate on other parts of the house as well. Corners of the living room, the space under the dining table, even the ceiling at times. It was as if he were tracking something invisible that moved freely around the house. These moments were fleeting but unmistakable. Every time they happened, Emma felt the air grow heavier, almost oppressive. In an attempt to reassure herself, Emma began searching for rational explanations. She booked a vet appointment, convinced that Max's strange behavior must have a physical cause. Maybe his hearing or vision was deteriorating, or perhaps he was experiencing some kind of canine anxiety. The vet, however, found nothing wrong. Max was healthy, even thriving for his age. Maybe he's just getting older and more cautious, the vet suggested. Dogs can sometimes become more alert as they age, especially if they're bonded to their owner. He might just be protecting you. Emma nodded, grateful for the reassurance, but unconvinced. Max's behavior didn't feel like caution or protectiveness. It felt like fear, and worse, it was starting to infect her. She began double-checking locks, turning on extra lights, and keeping her phone within arm's reach at all times. Her sleep began to suffer. Every night she would lie in bed, staring at the faint outline of Max in the doorway, his silhouette illuminated by the soft glow of her computer screen. She tried sleeping with the door closed once, hoping to block out whatever had captured Max's attention, but the experiment lasted less than an hour. Max had scratched and whined at the door incessantly until she finally let him back in. "You're driving me crazy, Max," she whispered one night, her voice trembling. "What do you see out there?" The silence that followed was deafening. Max didn't respond, of course, but his body language spoke volumes. His ears twitched, his tail gave a nervous flick, and he let out a low growl. Emma's breath hitched. Max wasn't the kind of dog to growl, ever. It wasn't in his nature. Yet here he was, growling softly at the empty hallway, his hackles slightly raised. Emma reached for her phone, using its flashlight to sweep the area. Nothing, just the same old shadows and furniture. But as she turned the light off, she swore. She saw something. A faint movement in the corner of her eye, gone before she could focus on it. She froze, her heart pounding, and turned back to Max. He was staring at her now, his eyes wide and filled with what she could only describe as desperation. The next morning, Emma decided to do something she hadn't done in years. She prayed. Sitting at the kitchen table with Max by her side, she clasped her hands together and whispered a simple plea for protection and clarity. It felt silly, almost childish, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her world was beginning to unravel. Max rested his head on her lap, letting out a soft sigh. It was the most relaxed he had been in days, but Emma couldn't help wondering, was it her prayer that calmed him, or was it something else entirely? The following evening, Emma resolved to dig deeper into the strange thread on the deep web. Her nerves were frayed, and Max's behavior continued to gnaw at her mind. He remained restless and alert, and his focus on invisible things around the house seemed more deliberate. She couldn't ignore it anymore. There had to be an explanation, or at the very least, a clue. Sitting in her dimly lit room, Emma navigated back to the forum where it had all begun. The thread had grown longer since her last visit, with new posts detailing eerie pet encounters. Some described harmless but odd behaviors, like cats hissing at walls or birds avoiding certain windows. Others were more disturbing, hinting at supernatural forces. Emma scrolled through the posts, her unease growing with each story. Then she saw it, a message that seemed almost directed at her. For those whose pets are acting differently, you need to listen to them. They're trying to protect you. If you want to understand, follow the link below, but be warned, you may not like what you find. The post was signed with a username she hadn't noticed before, Watcher101. Something about it felt too personal, as if the person had written it specifically for her. Against her better judgment, Emma clicked the link, her screen briefly going black before loading a minimalist web page with a single downloadable file labeled Instructions for Speaking to Them. Her heart raced. What was this? Instructions to talk to her dog? It seemed ridiculous, like some kind of elaborate prank. And yet, the thought gnawed at her. What if there was something real to it? What if understanding Max could help her figure out what was going on? After a moment of hesitation, Emma downloaded the file. The document was a simple text file, but its contents were anything but simple. It listed a series of steps, written in an ominously calm tone. Create a quiet, dark space where you and your pet can sit without distractions. Place your hands on their head and focus on their breathing. Repeat the following phrase 3 times. I am here to understand. I am here to see. Wait for their response. Be patient. It may not come immediately. If your pet does not respond, do not attempt again. If they do, listen carefully. Emma stared at the instructions, her fingers trembling slightly. The rational part of her screamed that this was a bad idea. But the irrational part, the part fueled by sleepless nights and Max's unsettling behavior, whispered that she had nothing to lose. She decided to try it. Turning off the lights, she created a quiet space in her living room. She sat cross-legged on the floor, Max lying in front of her. He seemed calm, his golden eyes reflecting the faint glow of the streetlights outside. "Okay, Max," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's see what this is all about." Placing her hands gently on his head, she closed her eyes and focused on the rhythm of his breathing. It was slow and steady, a soothing contrast to the anxiety bubbling in her chest. Taking a deep breath, Emma began repeating the phrase, I am here to understand. I am here to see. The words felt strange in her mouth, like they didn't belong to her. She repeated them again, then a third time. The room felt impossibly silent, the kind of silence that made her ears ring. For a moment, nothing happened. Max remained still beneath her hands, and Emma felt a pang of embarrassment. Of course, this was just some ridiculous hoax. What had she expected? But then Max shifted. It was subtle, a twitch of his ears, a slight movement of his head. But then it was enough to make Emma's heart leap. She opened her eyes, her breath catching in her throat. Max was staring at her with an intensity she had never seen before. His golden eyes seemed deeper, almost human, and for a moment Emma could have sworn she saw something, an emotion, a thought, flicker within them. "Max," she whispered. Her voice sounded foreign, shaky, and then it happened. At first, the sound was low, almost imperceptible, like a distant hum. It grew steadily, forming into something resembling a word. Emma froze as she realized the sound was coming from Max. His mouth didn't move, but the noise was unmistakable, a guttural, almost mechanical whisper. Emma. Her name. He had said her name. Emma's blood ran cold. She pulled her hands back instinctively, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Max remained still, his gaze unwavering. For a moment, she thought she might have imagined it, but the sound replayed in her mind with perfect clarity. She wanted to run, to leave the room, but something kept her rooted in place. She took a shaky breath and reached out to Max again, her hands trembling. "Max, what's going on?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "What are you trying to tell me?" Max didn't respond, at least not immediately. He let out a soft whine, pressing his head against her hand. It was a gesture of comfort, one that Emma had felt countless times before, but now it carried a weight she didn't understand. She stroked his fur absently, her mind racing. What had just happened? How was it possible? Desperate for answers, Emma returned to the forum, her hands shaking as she typed out a new post. "I think my dog just spoke to me. Has this happened to anyone else?" The response was almost immediate. A user named Watcher101 replied, "If he spoke, it means you've been noticed. Be careful, they see you now." Emma stared at the screen, her stomach churning. Who were they? What did this mean? She glanced over at Max, who was now lying at her feet, his head resting on his paws. He looked peaceful, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something irreversible. The rest of the night passed in a haze. Emma couldn't sleep, her mind replaying the sound of Max's voice over and over. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard it again. Emma. It was a warning, she was sure of it. But a warning of what? Emma barely slept after the night Max spoke. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound amplified to an unbearable volume. The weight of his whispered Emma clung to her mind, a word. That felt less like recognition and more like a warning. But from what or from whom? The next day she tried to go about her routine as usual. Coffee, emails, and a half-hearted attempt at designing a client's logo. But everything felt muted, like the world was off kilter. Max, normally her cheerful shadow, followed her more closely than ever, his golden eyes never leaving her. Whenever she moved between rooms, he'd position himself strategically, as if guarding her from something invisible. "Max," she said softly, crouching to his level. "What are you trying to tell me?" His ears flicked at the sound of her voice, but he didn't respond. She stroked his fur absent-mindedly, her thoughts spiraling. She needed answers, and the only place she could think to look was the forum that had dragged her into this nightmare in the first place. That evening, Emma logged back onto the deep web, her heart pounding as she navigated to the thread. The gaze. Conversation had shifted dramatically. Posts were no longer just accounts of strange pet behaviors. They were warnings. If your pet has spoken, stop. Don't ask questions. Don't engage further. Another user wrote, "They're aware of you now. Once they see you, it's hard to escape." And then there it was, another post from Watcher 101. "The first encounter will always be subtle. Do not ignore it. Your pet is the only one who can protect you." Emma's stomach churned. The posts felt personal, directed. She had questions, too, many to ignore. But before she could type a response, a loud thud echoed from the living room. Her heart leapt into her throat. Max, who had been lying by her feet, shot up, ears perked and body tense. "Stay here," she whispered to him, grabbing her phone and hesitantly walking toward the sound. The living room was empty, or so it seemed. Everything was as it should be. The coffee table stacked with magazines, the curtains drawn, and the soft glow of a lamp casting warm light. But something felt off. The air was thick, oppressive, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Emma's gaze landed on the source of the noise. A book had fallen off the shelf. She approached it cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the carpet. The book lay open on the floor, its pages bent at an awkward angle. She reached down to pick it up, and as her fingers brushed the cover, a faint sound, like static, buzzed in her ears. She froze, her heart hammering. The static grew louder, morphing into a low, distorted hum. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through her skull. She stumbled back, her phone slipping from her hand and landing with a dull thud on the carpet. Emma, her name spoken again in that same guttural, mechanical voice. But this time it wasn't Max. Emma spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The room was empty, yet the voice had been so close, as though someone had whispered directly into her ear. Max burst into the room, growling low and deep, his hackles raised. He positioned himself between Emma and the empty space where the sound had come from, his body rigid with tension. "Max," she stammered, her voice barely audible. The static subsided, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Max continued to growl, his gaze fixed on the corner of the room. Emma followed his line of sight but saw nothing. Still, the air in that corner felt wrong. She couldn't describe it, but it was as though the space itself was vibrating, subtly distorted. Emma backed away slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for her phone. She fumbled to turn on the flashlight, aiming it toward the corner. The beam cut through the shadows, illuminating nothing but bare walls and furniture. Yet Max didn't relax. His growls turned into sharp barks, loud and urgent, each one making Emma flinch. "Stop it, Max!" she cried, her voice cracking. But he didn't stop. He barked and barked, his body taut with fear and aggression. Finally, he lunged forward, snapping at the empty air. Emma grabbed his collar, pulling him back. "What's wrong with you?" she demanded, though the question felt hollow. She wasn't angry, she was terrified. Whatever Max was reacting to, she knew it wasn't imaginary. She dragged him back to her bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it. Max panted heavily, his tail tucked between his legs. He climbed onto the bed, pressing himself against her, as though seeking comfort, or offering it. Emma sat there in the dark, clutching her phone and staring at the door. Her thoughts raced, each one more irrational than the last. She knew she couldn't stay in the house much longer. Something had changed, something she couldn't explain. Before she could think further, her phone buzzed in her hand, the sudden vibration making her jump. She glanced at the screen. It was a notification from the forum, a private message from Watcher 101. "It's only the beginning. Don't let them in." Emma's blood turned cold. She stared at the message, her mind reeling. She wanted to respond, to demand answers, but her fingers felt paralyzed. Max let out a low whimper, nuzzling against her. She wrapped her arms around him, her fear momentarily replaced by a desperate need to protect him. Who or what was trying to get in? As the night stretched on, Emma realized one horrifying truth. Whatever was happening, it wasn't going to stop. The first encounter had come and gone, but the real danger was only just beginning. The message from Watcher 101 haunted Emma. It's only the beginning. Don't let them in. What did it mean? And why did it feel like the user was speaking directly to her? She needed answers, but with every passing hour, the weight of her fear grew heavier. Max's constant vigilance only added to her unease. Whatever was happening, it felt as though her home was no longer her own. Determined to uncover the truth, Emma dove deeper into the thread. The posts had taken on a darker tone, with users sharing warnings instead of stories. Phrases like "they can see you now" and "the veil is thinning" appeared repeatedly, cryptic yet unsettling. Emma searched for Watcher 101's older posts, hoping to find some context. Their contributions to the thread spanned months, detailing an intricate web of warnings and cryptic insights about the connection between pets and the unseen. One post caught Emma's attention. "Pets act as our guardians. They see what we can't, but they can only protect us for so long. If you've noticed changes in your pet, you've already been marked. Stay vigilant and don't trust what you hear." Her stomach churned. Marked? By what? The idea was absurd, yet the events of the past few days made it impossible to dismiss. Her mind raced as she considered the implications. Had her curiosity opened a door she couldn't close? Later that evening, she noticed something strange on her computer. While revisiting the thread, her screen flickered, briefly displaying what appeared to be an IP address before vanishing. Her heart skipped a beat. Was someone tracking her? Paranoia began to creep in. She checked her router settings, scanned for malware, and even considered disconnecting from the internet entirely. But none of her precautions eased the gnawing feeling that she was being watched. Max's behavior confirmed her suspicions. He followed her everywhere, his eyes darting toward unseen corners, his growls more frequent and urgent. Emma's attempts to comfort him felt hollow. The bond they once shared now carried an undercurrent of dread, as though they were both waiting for something to happen. The breaking point came when Emma discovered a new message in her private inbox. It wasn't from Watcher 101 this time. The sender's username was a string of random letters and numbers, and the subject line simply read, "You can't hide." Her hands trembled as she opened the message. The body of the text was brief, but chilling. "Your dog can't save you, they're already inside." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She immediately glanced at Max, who was standing by the door, his posture stiff. His ears twitched, and he let out a sharp bark, his eyes fixed on the darkened hallway. The next morning, Emma felt like a ghost of herself. Her eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, and her body ached from staying tense all night. Max seemed just as drained, but his loyalty kept him glued to her side, his every move protective and deliberate. She couldn't shake the events of the previous night, the power outage, the voices, and the cryptic warnings. Whatever was happening, it was far from over. Desperate for clarity, Emma returned to the forum, hoping Watcher 101 could provide more insight. The thread had exploded with activity overnight, filled with users reporting similar experiences. Posts described power outages, shadowy figures, and voices mimicking loved ones. One particularly chilling post read, "They're feeding on your fear. The more scared you are, the stronger they become." Emma's heart sank. Was that why they were targeting her? Had her paranoia and sleepless nights made her a beacon for whatever they were? Amidst the noise, Watcher 101 had left another message, pinned to the top of the thread. They are the Watchers. They exist in the spaces we cannot see but that animals can. Pets are our last line of defense, but once you've been marked, the Watchers grow stronger. The more you acknowledge them, the closer they come. Emma stared at the words, her stomach twisting into knots. She had seen something, felt something, and acknowledged it. Was that why her home now felt like it was teetering on the edge of two realities? Her mind raced back to Max's initial changes, his fixation on shadows, his growls at empty corners. He had been trying to warn her from the beginning. Her thoughts were interrupted by a new notification, another private message from Watcher 101. It read, "If Max starts acting more agitated, you're running out of time. The Watchers can't cross the threshold until you let them. They will try to trick you. Trust Max, he will know the difference." Emma felt a lump rise in her throat. Trust Max. He was her only ally in this nightmare, but how much longer could he hold them back? She closed the laptop and turned to Max, who was sitting by the window, his ears twitching. His gaze was fixed on the glass, and Emma followed his. Line of sight. The street outside was eerily quiet, bathed in the golden hues of late afternoon. At first she saw nothing unusual. Then she noticed it, a figure standing across the street, completely still. It wasn't moving, and the longer Emma stared, the more unnatural it seemed. Its outline was blurred, almost as if it were vibrating at a frequency she couldn't quite perceive. Max let out a low growl, his body tense. Emma stepped back from the window, her pulse racing. She grabbed her phone and snapped a picture, hoping the lens might capture what her eyes couldn't. When she checked the image, her blood ran cold. The figure wasn't there. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This can't be real." Max barked sharply, breaking her trance. He turned toward the front door, his growls deepening. Emma's chest tightened. Was it here? Whatever the Watchers were, they seemed to be getting bolder. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the familiar weight of dread settled over Emma. She turned on every light in the house and sat in the living room with Max at her feet. Her laptop sat open, on the coffee table, but she couldn't bring herself to look at the forum again. Instead, she clutched her phone, its flashlight pointed at the doorway. As the hours dragged on, the atmosphere grew heavier. The air felt charged, like a storm about to break. Max's behavior became increasingly erratic. He paced the room, his growls turning into frantic barks. He'd stop suddenly, staring at the walls or ceiling, his tail low and rigid. Emma's heart pounded as she tried to soothe him, but nothing seemed to calm him down. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost hesitant. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. The knock came again, louder this time, echoing through the quiet house. Max positioned himself between her and the door, barking furiously. His hackles were raised and his teeth bared. "Who's there?" Emma called out, her voice trembling. No response. The knock came again, insistent and deliberate. Emma's phone buzzed, the sudden vibration making her jump. A text appeared on the screen. It was from an unknown number. "Let me in, Emma. It's me." Her heart sank. The message was accompanied by a picture, her sister's face smiling warmly. But Emma knew it wasn't real. Her sister lived 3 states away, and they hadn't spoken in months. The Watchers were trying to trick her, just as Watcher No. 1 had warned. The knocking stopped, replaced by a low whisper that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "Emma, please. It's cold out here." The voice sounded like her sister's, but there was an unnatural quality to it, a hollow echo that made Emma's skin crawl. Max barked even louder, his body pressing against her as if to shield her from the unseen presence. Emma clung to him, her knuckles white as she gripped his collar. "You're not real," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You can't. Come in." The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices, all pleading for entry. The lights in the house flickered, and Emma felt a deep, bone-chilling cold seep into the room. She buried her face in Max's fur, tears streaming down her face as she repeated over and over, "You're not real. You're not real." Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voices stopped. The lights stabilized, and the oppressive cold lifted. Emma opened her eyes, her body trembling. Max had stopped barking, but his body remained tense, his gaze fixed on the door. Emma's phone buzzed again. Another message from Watcher 101. "They will try again. Stay strong. Max is your anchor. They fear him more than they fear you. Emma." Let out a shaky breath, clutching Max tightly. Whatever the Watchers were, they weren't giving up. But as long as Max was by her side, she had a chance. She just had to hold on. The following day, Emma felt the weight of exhaustion bearing down on her, but she couldn't afford to let her guard down. The events of the previous night confirmed one thing. The Watchers were escalating. Each encounter was growing bolder, more invasive, and Emma's thin barrier of safety was fraying. Max had been her constant shield, but even he seemed weary. His barks, his growls, and his vigilant pacing made it clear that the battle wasn't over. Emma turned to Watcher 101 for guidance, her desperation bleeding into every message she typed. "How do I make this stop? What do they want? Please, I can't keep doing this." She sent the message and stared at her screen, willing a response to come. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. Max nudged her hand, his warm nose breaking. Through the fog of her anxiety, she looked down at him, his eyes filled with a quiet determination that steadied her fraying nerves. "It's just us, huh?" she whispered, running her fingers through his fur. "We'll figure this out." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma felt the familiar sense of dread return. She prepared the house as best she could, turning on every light and double-checking the locks. Her phone buzzed with a new message just as she settled onto the couch with Max by her side. It was from Watcher 101. "This is your last chance. If they come again, do not acknowledge them. Don't listen to their voices, don't answer their knocks, and whatever you do, don't open the door. Max will know when they're gone." Emma read the message over and over, her pulse quickening. It was clear now that she was out of time. Whatever had been stalking her through the thin veil between realities would make its final attempt tonight. She had to be ready. Hours passed in tense silence, the hum of the lights the only sound in the house. Emma sat with her back to the wall, Max lying at her feet. His ears twitched occasionally, but otherwise he remained calm. The stillness was suffocating, every creak of the house making Emma jump. Then it began. A single knock echoed through the house, louder than before, reverberating in her chest. Max immediately shot to his feet, his body rigid as a low growl rumbled in his throat. Emma's heart pounded as she stared at the door, every instinct screaming at her to stay where she was. The knock came again, this time followed by a voice. "Emma, it's me, let me in." It was her mother's voice, warm and familiar. But Emma knew better. Her mother had passed away years ago. The realization sent a cold wave of fear washing over her. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself, gripping Max's fur for comfort. His growls grew louder, his body positioned protectively in front of her. The voice persisted, growing more desperate. "Emma, please. I need to talk to you. Open the door." It was uncanny how perfectly it mimicked her mother's tone, her cadence. But there was something hollow about it, an emptiness that made Emma's skin crawl. She closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing. She wouldn't respond. She couldn't. The knocks turned into pounding, and the voice became a chorus, overlapping whispers and shouts that filled the room. "Emma, let us in. We can help you." The lights began to flicker, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Emma wrapped her arms around Max, tears streaming down her face as the cacophony grew unbearable. The shadows on the walls began to twist and writhe, forming grotesque shapes that seemed to reach for her. "Focus," she whispered through clenched teeth. "It's not real. They can't get in." Max barked furiously, snapping at the shadows, his movements frantic but purposeful. His presence was the only thing keeping Emma grounded, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. She held onto him tightly, refusing to let the fear consume her. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The room fell into an eerie silence, broken only by Emma's ragged breathing and Max's panting. The light stabilized, and the oppressive cold lifted. Emma opened her eyes cautiously, her body trembling. The house was still, the shadows motionless. Max turned to her, his tail wagging slightly, and let out a soft whine. Emma felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was short-lived. Her phone buzzed again and she hesitated before picking it up. The screen displayed one final message from Watcher 101. "They're gone for now, but they'll always be watching. You survived because you trusted Max. Never forget, your dog is your shield, and as long as he's with you, you'll be safe. But remember, curiosity is what brought them to you. Don't go looking for answers again. You won't like what you find." Emma stared at the message, the weight of its warning sinking in. She looked at Max, who was now lying at her feet, his head resting on his paws. He looked exhausted but content, as though his job was done, for now. The events of the night had left Emma shaken, but she knew one thing for certain. She would never revisit that thread, never explore the dark corners of the internet that had brought this nightmare into her life. Her curiosity had nearly cost her everything. As the first rays of sunlight seeped through the windows, Emma finally allowed herself to relax. She leaned down to hug Max, burying her face in his fur. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick, with emotion. "You saved me." Max let out a soft huff, his tail wagging gently. Emma knew the Watchers weren't gone forever, but for now, she was safe. And as long as Max was by her side, she would be ready for whatever came next.